In his sermon, Does God Heal?, preacher Sam Wells observes, there are two types of healing in the Christian church. There's what you might call loud healing, and there's what you might call quiet healing. What's the distinction? Well, loud healing involves lots of shouting, lots of waving of the hands. It exudes confidence and boldness, and it often stretches the name of Jesus into 4 syllables. Jesus. Perhaps some of you are familiar with loud healing. You grew up in churches that practiced it. Quiet healing, on the other hand, he says, uses words like wholeness and journey. Quiet healing doesn't like large crowds. It resists definition and tries not to be too sure of anything except that it wants to stay far, far away from loud healing. I'm curious, which is your preferred type? Are there any loud healing folks in the room? Come on, be brave. I had a feeling it wouldn't be most of you. You'd probably go to a different church if that was the case. But what about quiet healing folks? Yeah, you don't want to be so defined, I understand. Okay, all right. Well, we've been exploring the ministry of Jesus in the Gospel of Luke, and in our text this morning, we're actually going to see examples, I think, of both types of healing. Jairus, the synagogue leader, begs Jesus to heal his daughter, and when Jesus is finally at his home, standing before the young girl, he yells at her, "Child, get up." Loud healing, right? But sandwiched within this story of loud healing is another story, a story of an unnamed woman who wants to be quiet and hidden. And her healing, we will see, as a journey towards wholeness that occurs in stages. Open up with me, if you will, to Luke chapter 8. If you brought a Bible with you, you have a Bible app on your phone. I'll also, for those of you who are here in our building, I will put it up on the screen. We are in Luke 8, starting in verse 40. Now, when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. Just then, there came a man named Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. He fell at Jesus' feet and begged him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, who was dying. So Jairus, we're told, is the leader of the local synagogue. For those of you new to the New Testament, the center of Jewish religion in the first century was the temple. There was only one temple, and it was located in the city Jerusalem. That's where sacrifices would be made. That's where all the great festivals were centered. Synagogues, on the other hand, were many. And they were scattered out throughout the rest of the land of Israel and beyond. And it's where the Old Testament was taught and studied, and where Jews who lived outside of Jerusalem would worship on a weekly basis. So Jairus oversees one of these many synagogues. That, of course, means that he's well known, he's well respected, his social status exceedingly high within his community. But alas, I think we all know this, but personal tragedy knows no social distinctions. It affects rich and poor alike, doesn't it? And Jairus, his only child, his 12-year-old daughter, is sick and dying. What does he do? This man of distinction, this man of high status and honor and respect, he falls at Jesus' feet and begs him. Isn't that remarkable? It's a remarkable moment. Jairus just throws his status to the side and gets his face in the dirt before Jesus. Now, this is a different scenario, but it reminds me of the early church leader Paul, who in his letter to a church in Philippi, that's northern Greece, he begins listing off in chapter 3 all of his status markers, everything that made him respected and admired and distinguished. He says, I was a Hebrew of Hebrews, a true Israelite, born of the tribe Benjamin, of the Pharisee party, devoted to the law. And he says, whatever gains I had from these, whatever advantages, he says, I consider it all loss in comparison to knowing Christ. I throw it to the side. See, when you are before Jesus, whether you're desperate and you need his healing power like Jairus, or you want to gain Christ and be found in him like Paul, everything else you cling to, your name, your status, your identity, it just doesn't matter. Not in the presence of Christ. Well, Jesus doesn't even say anything in response to Jairus. He just begins walking with him to his house. It continues. As he went, the crowds pressed in on him. Now, there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, and though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. Okay, so notice here that the story of Jairus just stops, doesn't it? It just stops because there's an interruption in their journey, an interruption caused by a woman suffering from hemorrhages. This woman has a problem with bleeding. What kind of bleeding? Almost every New Testament commentator says most likely it's abnormal uterine bleeding, bleeding from the uterus. Female bleeding in between the normal menstrual cycle. Parents, you can have a nice conversation on the way home with your kids. Now, the bleeding couldn't have been too terrible for her. Why? Well, she's survived the condition for 12 years, right? So she's not going to die from this. It's likely not a ton of blood that's lost. It's just enough. It's just enough and often enough for her to be constantly ritually unclean or impure. Now, I have mentioned this phrase before. I want to talk about it a little bit more this morning. To be ritually impure means that you're unfit to be in the temple, you're unfit to be in the synagogues, and you're really unfit to engage with normal society. Why? Because it was highly contagious, communicated through touch. Now, before we go any further, I know that it is far too easy for us 21st century folk to sort of shake our heads in dismay at these quote-unquote primitive peoples for caring about something as fussy as ritual impurity. But try to understand their mind for a moment. This is before running water. This is before sinks and showers. It's unclear the availability and accessibility of soap for first century Jews in this region. You can't just take a shower and you'll be fine. Part of the reason, perhaps, the first century Jews were fussy about uncleanness was for public health, a way to contain dirt and keep things moderately clean in a society with little soap and running water. But it is more than that. The reason why bleeding like this made you unclean was not just for public health. Now, this is what I'm going to share with you is somewhat conjecture, it's somewhat guess, but it is educated guess. The reason bleeding like this made a person unclean in the ancient mind, perhaps, was because bleeding involves a breaking of the body's boundaries. Blood is supposed to stay inside, not come outside, right? Of course, we know this. And blood is our source of life. And when blood breaks the boundaries of the body, well, that signifies the loss of life or the potential loss of life. Or, listen closely, the loss of potential life. What do I mean by that last phrase? Well, first century Jews knew very well, like we do, that if a woman bleeds as part of her monthly cycle, she's not pregnant, she's without child. And so they would have seen that as the loss of potential life. And here's the point. The breaking of the body's boundaries and bleeding reminded them too much of death. And death must always be contained and quarantined as much as possible. Now, of course, if you're the one who reminds people of death, if you're the one whose body's boundaries are broken, if you're the one who's bleeding, if you're the one who is ritually impure, what does that mean for you? For most people, in most circumstances, it's actually not that big of a deal. You just go through the cleansing rituals. You wash the reminder of death off of you, and you're good to go. That is, unless you can't. Unless you can't, because it won't stop. And that's this woman's condition. She's constantly ritually impure because she can never wash herself of that reminder of death. And what are the implications of this for her life? Isolation. Social isolation for the past 12 years. No man would marry her. He couldn't. He'd be perpetually unclean too. And not only is she isolated and lonely, we're told she spent all her money on physicians trying to get healed. So she's broke now too. Let's continue. She came up behind him, touched the fringe of his clothes, and immediately her hemorrhage stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds surround you and press in on you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." Would you be this brave if you were this woman? I wouldn't. I know I wouldn't. I mean, this is going to sound crazy to you, but I hate being singled out in crowds, having everyone look at me. Have you ever been at a large event, like a luncheon or a sports event or something, and there's that raffle drawing, like 50-50 or whatever? If they choose your ticket, you get a prize. Or even radio stations, call in at this time and you might win big. I never enter those. Why? Because I don't want to win. Because if I win, that means I'll have to walk up on stage and receive it, or be heard on the radio, or something like that. Now, some of you are putting the pieces together right now and wondering how in the world I became a preacher, right? Look, the only way this works is because I'm picturing you all in your underwear right now. But anyways, I did pass that joke by a few people, and they said it was okay. So maybe a little creepy, admittedly, but I don't know how this thing works. I've always been fine with public speaking, never been scared of that. But in any other context, I am so frightened of the eyes of a crowd. And this woman is my opposite. She's brave, isn't she? Maybe even a bit brash. Maybe she's desperate. And the crowd is pressing in on Jesus, and she sneaks up to him anyways, probably touching all sorts of people, right? Doing what? Making them ritually impure as well. That is, if they find out. If they don't, no harm, no foul, right? She doesn't need to tell them. She reaches out, touches the edge of his garment, and all of a sudden she feels something. She feels her blood bleeding stop. She knows her body so well. She knows she's healed. And once that happens, what does she still need to do? Just get away, right? Just sneak back out of the crowd so no one knows. Only Jesus won't let her, because he stops and he says, "Who touched me?" Now, his disciple Peter is confused by this because, well, what's the correct answer to that question? Everyone. Everyone is touching you, Jesus. But he insists, no, I know someone intentionally touched me. I felt power go out of me. And here's what happened next. Verse 47. When the woman saw that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling. And falling down before him, she declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. So I want to point something out. She falls down in front of Jesus and declares in the presence of everyone, not just that she touched him, right? She could have just said, "I admit it, it was me, I touched him." No, what does it say? It says that she declared why she touched him. And what would be included in that declaration of why? The hemorrhaging, the ritual impurity. So what she does is, in this moment, is she declares her hemorrhaging and her ritual impurity in front of this crowd that has been pressing in on her and Jesus. I'm sure the crowd is shocked and scandalized, wondering if they too now are impure. But before they can say anything, Jesus speaks up first. Verse 48, he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Think just for a moment about that word, that first word, daughter. What is Jesus saying by using that word? Is he just trying to be polite? No. You know what he's doing? He's claiming her as part of his family. He's claiming her as part of his family based not on ancestry, but based on faith. You know, one of the most interesting questions to ask about this story is this. When exactly was the woman healed? Was it when she snuck up and touched Jesus' garment? That's obviously when she was physically healed, right? That's when the bleeding stopped. But of course, her illness wasn't only physical, was it? Of course not. The best way to think about her healing, I think, is to say that it was a two-stage process. She was, of course, physically healed when she touched his cloak. That was stage one, but she still wasn't yet made whole. Why wasn't she yet made whole after she touched his cloak? Because it says afterwards that she still wanted to remain hidden. And remember, this woman's primary form of suffering was not physical, it was social. She has been suffering social isolation for 12 years, and yet even after she touches his cloak, she still wants to remain hidden. The second stage of her healing happens when Jesus calls her out. And she comes forward trembling. She tells the truth about herself, and Jesus claims her as part of his family. That's, of course, when she then hears those words, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Or you could translate that, "Daughter, your faith has made you whole. Go in peace." And so she leaves honored. She leaves honored by Jesus, who claims her as part of his family and commends her faith. She leaves restored to community with her head held high. Okay, so that's a touching story and all. But if you're wondering what happened to Jairus and his daughter, I have no doubt Jairus was wondering the same thing. What about me, right? What about my daughter? See, this whole scene in verses 43 through 48 is wonderful and inspiring, except for Jairus, right? He must be going crazy because time is running out, and sure enough, while Jesus was still interacting with the woman, someone arrives from his house. Look at verse 49 with me. While he was still speaking, someone came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter's dead. Don't trouble the teacher any longer." And when Jesus heard this, he replied, "Do not fear, only believe, and she will be saved." And when he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him, except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. They were all weeping and wailing for her, but he said, "Do not weep, for she's not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. So it's a little confusing what's happening here, especially when we compare this story to the same story that Matthew and Mark tell in their Gospels. Who exactly is weeping and wailing and then laughing? It looks in this story like maybe it's her parents, or the girl's parents, or Peter, James, and John, or all of them. Probably not, though. Probably not. It was probably a larger group. The they all there is probably the extended relatives, the other family members, and also what would have been the professional mourners. Now, this is kind of an odd thing to us, but in the first century, one available occupation was professional crying. Go ahead and nudge the person next to you if you think they'd be good at that job. Some of you siblings are like. The reason why there were professional mourners is not because they wanted to actually make a show of it, over-traumatize the sorrow of the occasion, to make up for the fact that the family wasn't crying or something like that. The reason why you hire people to weep and wail at someone's death is actually to make things less awkward for the ones who truly are weeping. To, in other words, free the family up to express their grief in whatever way they choose without shame. I've been to so many funerals, how good it would be and helpful for the family if we brought back professional mourners. So the family doesn't have to sit in that awkward space of feeling so much grief and yet feeling like they have to be respectable at the same time. Anyways, this house or this household is filled with people, relatives, professional criers, and there's all this commotion as Jesus approaches the house, and their weeping then turns to laughter when Jesus suggests the daughter is only sleeping. And so Jesus then kicks them out of the house or bars them from entering, and that's how the story is told in Matthew and Mark. If you look closely, it's told a little bit different in Luke. It's a little bit confusing here. I think the best way to understand what Luke is saying is to treat verses 52 and 53 as being in parentheses. Listen closely. Luke is explaining in those verses 52 and 53, why he barred everyone from entering the house except the parents and Peter, James, and John. And this is again clearer in Matthew and Mark, but I think Luke's point is the same, that the only people who get to witness this young girl's revival are those who have faith that he can do what he promised. Let's continue in verse 54. But he took her by the hand and called out, "Child, get up." And her spirit returned, and she got up at once. Then he directed them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he ordered them to tell no one what had happened. So I'm not exactly sure what good this gag order will do in the end here, right? I mean, there's a whole crowd outside that is going to figure out sooner rather than later that the little girl is alive. But oh well, sometimes we just don't totally understand what's going on. The main point is the girl is revived. Jesus has power over death, and that is our text. So these two stories in the Gospel of Luke chapter 8 are certainly about healing. They're about Jesus' power to heal. But you'll notice that they're also about faith. Faith plays a role in both stories, right? The hemorrhaging woman is commended for her faith. Verse 48 again, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. And then, of course, in the next story, Jesus encourages Jairus to have faith. Verse 50 again, only believe or have faith, and she will be saved. So these stories are about healing, but even perhaps more so, they're about faith and the role that faith plays in healing or being saved. Now listen, I don't believe that faith itself heals or saves. Faith itself does not have healing power. How do we know this? From the text, actually, from the stories. In the story of the hemorrhaging woman, where does healing power reside? In Jesus' cloak, right? In the fringe of his garment. In the story of Jairus' daughter, where does healing power reside? In Jesus' words, right? As he says, child, get up. So faith itself does not have healing power, but here's the key point. It opens you up to the one who does. It opens you up to the one who does. Now, we have seen this before in the Gospel of Luke, at least 3 times that I can think of right now. Seen the faith of the paralytic's friends who lowered him down through that roof. We've seen the faith of a centurion who believed that Jesus could heal his servant if he only spoke the word. We've seen the faith of a sinful woman or a prostitute who poured ointment on Jesus' feet. In other words, we have seen faith give access to healing and saving power. What's interesting then in our stories this morning is that this faith that accesses healing and saving power has to overcome obstacles. The first obstacle is people. The second obstacle is time. So the first obstacle is people. And we see this in the story of the hemorrhaging woman. Remember her 2-stage healing, right? The first stage is physical. The second stage, you can maybe say, is psychological or social or relational, something like that. In the first stage of her healing, it's the literal physical bodies of people that she has to overcome. She has to wade through the crowd that we're told is pressing in on Jesus just to touch his cloak and have her bleeding stop. So overcoming the physical presence of the crowd is the key to the first stage of her healing. But what about the second stage? In the second stage of her healing, she has to overcome not their bodies, but their eyes. See, when she finally comes forward trembling after Jesus calls her out, she has to trust Jesus enough to be willing to risk the judgmental perception of the crowd. Their raised eyes as they begin to hear her confession. Their widened eyes as they put 2 and 2 together and realize that this ritually impure person has been in their midst. Their squinted eyes looking at disdain towards this woman who is so unclean. She has to be willing to risk not just their eyes, but also their words, their inevitable condemnation, their inevitable command for her to leave, expelling her from their midst, further ostracism. But because of her faith, because of her trust, that surely grew when she touched his cloak, right? Because of her trust, she overcame the judgmental eyes of the crowd to disclose her problem and to tell her story. Remember, she doesn't just confess what she did, she confesses why she did it. She tells her story. She discloses her problem. She gives voice to her pain. And because of that, because her faith overcame the judgmental eyes of the crowd, she then experienced the second stage of her healing. What was that? Her restoration to community. Listen, church, here's the point. We access healing power. We access the healing power of Jesus, and we can experience a restoration to true community when we're willing to disclose our problems and tell our stories. We're too small of a church for me to share examples of this, examples in this community, but I have seen this take place with some of you. And I've also seen the opposite. I've seen some of you hold on to your pain and refuse to tell your story and refuse to share your problems. The kind of faith that heals and makes whole overcomes the fear of human approval. It persists in the presence of people's eyes and is willing to disclose pain and tell its story. How? How? Is it willing to disclose its pain and tell its story because it trusts the crowd? Because it trusts that its secret is safe with them? No, right? No, the reason why faith can overcome the judgmental perception of the crowd is not because the crowd is so trustworthy, but because Jesus has called you out. And Jesus stands before you, and like this woman, in his presence, you are safe. He claims you as part of his family. You leave honored no matter what, with your head held high. All right, the second obstacle is time. So this is the obstacle, I think, that Jairus' faith must overcome. See, the interaction between Jesus and the hemorrhaging woman, that was great and all, except it took too much time, right? And time was running out on his daughter's life, and yet they're stuck in the crowd. I mean, just try to read this story on your own sometime from Jairus' perspective. And you will not like verses 43 through 48. It takes too much time. It's hard to trust Jesus when he lingers, isn't it? It's hard to trust Jesus when his response to your request takes so much time. I know the experience. Do you? You have some problem or some issue, something you want from Jesus, and it's not a nicer car and a nicer house. Or maybe it is, if your car's broke and you're in a cramped apartment. The point is, it's not some ridiculous request. It's something that you want, that you know he wants for you. You want to be made whole. You want to be healed. You want this issue to go away. You want this reconciliation to happen. And you're journeying with Jesus, and it's hard to say why the interruptions keep happening. It's kind of hard to say who's the one getting distracted, you or him. But either way, it's taking too long. And now you're an adult. You're still dealing with the same stuff you should have gotten over when you were a kid, or you've been praying for someone or something over and over and over. Why isn't he moving faster? What's taking him so long? Does he not know I'm inwardly dying? Does he not know the time is running out? The kind of faith, church, that accesses divine healing is a faith that persists over time. It holds on even when God's timing isn't ours, that holds on even when the journey feels too long and too slow. Again, I ask how? How does faith persist over time? I want to suggest to you that the answer is similar to the first time we asked that question. It's because of the presence of Jesus. Because realize that as Jairus is making this journey and he has to stop and he has to wait for this interaction to take place, and they continue on the journey, and people come back to say his daughter's already dead, don't bother the teacher any longer. Who is by his side? Jesus. The presence of Jesus along that journey. He walks with you even while you wait. Now, I have no doubt that Luke tells these stories of Jesus healing to encourage us. To encourage us to believe that he has the power to heal, and to encourage us to have faith in the midst of fear, to have courage and to have faith in the midst of the judging eyes of the crowd, to have faith in the midst of things just taking too long, to persist over time. I think, though, Luke also tells us these stories for another reason. I don't think that Luke tells us these stories just to encourage us that Jesus has the power to heal us physically and psychologically and socially today, although I think that's part of it. I didn't make a huge deal of this when we were going through this story. One thing stood out to me as I was reading. It was the touch of Jesus, right? Did you notice that? In the story of the hemorrhaging woman, this ritually impure person who contaminates other people through her touch, what does she do? She touches him. Does he say, get away from me, don't touch me? No, right? Commends her daughter, you're part of the family. He lets her touch him. And then, in the story of Jairus' daughter, it says he does something right before he yells, child, get up. You know what he does? He touches her hand. Now listen closely. There is one thing that is more contagious to the first century mind than the contamination brought about by blood. Do you know what that is? The contamination of a corpse. I mean, gosh, if anything reminds you of death, there it is. There she is, right? Her body lying cold there. And yet Jesus reaches out and touches the corpse. I think Luke is preparing us for something. We have seen this over and over again in the Gospel of Luke. That's why we keep talking about ritual impurity, because Jesus doesn't just heal people in the Gospel of Luke. He touches them. He specifically touches them or lets people touch him who are unclean. That's the leper. That's the unclean woman. The story that we actually, earlier in Luke 8, right before this one, Jesus goes to the most unclean place. We're going to look at the story. We're going to pick that story up in a couple weeks. He goes to the land of the Gentiles among pigs, ritually unclean animals for Jews, into the tombs. I mean, uncleanness and impurity is all around, and he goes right there just to save one person. Luke is trying to tell us something. He's getting us ready. He's getting us ready for the end of his story. He's not just telling a story about a Jesus who is powerful to save. He is trying to tell us a story about how Jesus saves. And how does Jesus save ultimately on the cross? By entering into our impurity, right? I mean, there he is dying on a cross, a corpse. There he is dying on a cross, the boundaries of his body broken on his forehead and his hands and his feet and his side with blood flowing down. Luke is preparing us for the climactic moment of the story when Jesus enters into our impurity, when he enters into our exclusion, when he enters into our pain, when he enters into our defilement and our sin and our death to make us whole. Luke is preparing us for the story of salvation. And the question for us then is, will you let him in? Will you let him into that darkness? Will you let him into those places in your mind and heart where you feel so icky and unclean? Will you let him into the place of sin? Will you let him into the parts of you that have long been dying? Will you give voice to your pain and tell your story? Let's pray. Jesus, we believe. Would you help our disbelief? We want to have faith, but would you help us when we don't have faith? God, for those of us in this room right now who feel in our hearts that you're knocking on their door, would we let you in? Not close ourselves off to you any longer. Would you enter into our stories, into our minds and hearts, and make us whole? It's in Jesus' name we pray, and all God's people said, amen.